Sometimes the most powerful promises are born from the deepest wounds. Clara Whitmore had spent 3 long years tending her small cabin alone, watching seasons pass without hearing another human voice for weeks at a time. Then she found Silas McGraw dying in her barn. The mountain man they called Grizzly was bleeding out from outlaw bullets, and Clara was his only hope. For 3 weeks she nursed him back to health with gentle hands and quiet prayers. When he finally opened his eyes and spoke, his words shook her to the core. "I'll make you a mother before spring," he said, with the conviction of a man who'd looked death in the face. It was a promise that would change both their lives forever. But can 2 lonely souls really find love in the unforgiving wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years before that fateful promise, Clara Whitmore had arrived at the mountain cabin with nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, and a heart full of grief. The small log structure sat on a natural ledge carved into the mountainside, overlooking a valley that stretched for miles in every direction. Pine trees towered like ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with snow most of the year. It was beautiful in its isolation, and that isolation was exactly what Clara had sought. Her husband Thomas had built this place as a hunting retreat, planning to retire here someday. But someday had never come for Thomas. A fever had taken him during their 3rd year of marriage, leaving Clara alone in their St. Louis home with debts she couldn't pay, and neighbors who whispered about the young widow who'd never given her husband, children. The cabin in the Colorado Territory represented escape from those whispers, from the pitying looks, from the empty rooms that still smelled of Thomas's pipe tobacco. The first winter had nearly killed her. Clara had underestimated the brutal reality of mountain survival. The cold bit through every gap in the cabin's chinked logs. Food stores ran dangerously low when early snows trapped her for weeks at a time. She learned to split wood with numb fingers, to melt snow for water when the creek froze solid, to stretch beans and salt pork through months of isolation. But Clara had discovered something unexpected in that struggle. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Each challenge overcome built confidence in her capable hands. She learned to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to track game through snow, to preserve meat and vegetables through the long winter months. The cabin became more than shelter, it became home. Her daily routines had settled into comfortable rhythms by the 3rd year. Morning prayers with her worn leather prayer book, the same one her mother had carried from Ireland decades earlier. The book's pages were soft as cloth from countless readings, its margins filled with pressed flowers and penciled notes from 3 generations of women. It anchored her to faith when loneliness threatened to overwhelm. After prayers came the practical work of survival, checking snares for rabbits and grouse, tending her small vegetable garden during growing season, maintaining her food stores, keeping the cabin in repair. Every task required careful attention. A mistake could mean the difference. Between life and death in this unforgiving landscape, evenings were the hardest. When work was done and darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, silence pressed against the cabin walls. Clara would read by candlelight, sometimes speaking aloud just to hear a human voice. She'd grown accustomed to her own company, but comfort wasn't the same as contentment. The loneliness had become a constant companion, as familiar as the sound of wind through pine trees. Some nights, Clara wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. Other nights, especially when she watched sunrise paint the peaks gold and pink, she felt blessed to witness such beauty. But Clara knew nothing of the reputation that preceded. The man bleeding in her barn, Silas McGraw, had earned the name Grizzly through 30 years of mountain living that had made him more legend than man. Standing 6.5 feet tall with shoulders like an ox, he moved through the wilderness with the fluid grace of a natural predator. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, streaked with silver that caught sunlight like metal threads. A thick beard covered half his face, but couldn't hide the intelligent grey eyes that missed nothing. Those who knew him spoke in whispers of impossible feats. Silas could track a wounded deer through a blizzard, call elk so convincingly that bulls would emerge from timber to investigate. He'd survived 3 different bear attacks, the scars mapping stories of violence across his chest and arms. Trappers claimed he could go weeks without speaking, moving through forests like smoke, taking what the land offered and leaving barely a trace of his passage. The bone-handled knife at his belt had belonged to his father, carved with intricate patterns that told the story of their family's connection to these mountains. His grandfather had been among the first fur traders to venture into this territory, establishing relationships with native tribes that had kept their family safe for generations. The knife represented continuity, legacy, the weight of tradition passed from father to son. But legends carried prices, and Silas had paid in isolation. His reputation preceded him into every settlement, every trading post. People saw the size of him, the weapons he carried, the predator's stillness in his movements. And assumptions followed. Dangerous, violent, unpredictable. Few bothered to look deeper, to see the man who could carve delicate wooden toys from pine scraps, who knew every birdsong in the forest, who'd never killed anything he couldn't use. The loneliness of his reputation had driven him deeper into the wilderness with each passing year. Better to live among creatures that judged him by actions rather than stories. Bears and mountain lions were honest in their intentions. They killed. For food, for territory, for survival. They didn't kill for sport or spread lies about those who lived differently. It was this reputation that had brought trouble to his doorstep 3 weeks before Clara found him bleeding. The Morrison gang had been terrorizing settlements from Colorado to Montana, robbing banks and stagecoaches with ruthless efficiency. Their leader, Jake Morrison, was a man who enjoyed inflicting pain almost as much as he enjoyed counting stolen money. When local law enforcement proved inadequate, territorial officials had quietly approached certain individuals known for their particular skills. Silas had initially refused their request. He wanted no part in civilization's problems, no involvement in the violence that seemed to follow law and order wherever it took root, but the officials had been persuasive in ways that appealed to his conscience. The Morrison gang wasn't simply stealing money, they were murdering innocent people for the pleasure of it. Their latest victim had been a family of 5, including 3 children under the age of 10. That detail had changed Silas's mind. Children deserved protection, even if their parents had been fool enough to venture into dangerous territory. He'd agreed to track the gang, to gather intelligence that might help authorities plan their capture. What he'd discovered was a gang far more organized and dangerous than anyone had realized. Morrison had 23 men under his command, each chosen for specific skills that made them formidable opponents. They moved with military precision, struck with overwhelming force, and disappeared into wilderness hideouts that could withstand siege conditions. Silas had been gathering information on their main camp when everything went wrong. A sentry had spotted his position and raised the alarm. What followed was a running-gun battle through 3 miles of mountain forest, with Silas using every trick he'd learned in 30 years of wilderness survival to stay ahead of pursuing outlaws. He'd made it to the dense timber above Clara's valley before blood loss and exhaustion finally brought him down. The last thing he remembered was stumbling through her barn door, his vision going dark as he collapsed into the hay. Clara's decision to help him had been automatic, driven by Christian compassion rather than calculation. She'd found him there, at dawn, checking her animals as she did every morning. The sight of a man that size, unconscious and bleeding, had terrified her, but the terror was quickly replaced by determination. She'd seen too much death already in her young life. If there was a chance to prevent another, she would take it, regardless of consequences. The prayer book her mother had left her was filled with stories of hospitality to strangers, of mercy extended without expectation of reward. This was what faith meant in practice, not just Sunday prayers, but daily choices to serve something larger than self-interest. For 3 weeks, Clara had tended his wounds with supplies meant for her own emergencies. She'd cleaned infected tissue, stitched torn flesh, spooned broth between fever-cracked lips. She'd prayed over his unconscious form, reading aloud from scripture during the long hours when his breathing was so shallow she feared he might slip away without warning. Gradually, his body had responded to her care. Color returned to his face. His breathing deepened and steadied. The angry red lines of infection faded to pale scars. On the morning he finally opened his eyes and spoke that shocking promise, Clara realized she'd been holding her breath for 3 weeks, waiting for this moment of recognition. "I'll make you a mother before spring." The words had hit her like physical blows, raising heat in her cheeks and sending her heart hammering against her ribs. No man had ever spoken to her with such raw certainty, such complete disregard for propriety. Yet something in his grey eyes had held her frozen, unable to flee or protest as she should have. There had been no mockery in his expression, no calculation or casual lust. Instead, she'd seen something that frightened her more than outright threat, genuine intention, backed by a will that had never learned to accept defeat. The storm had arrived without warning, as mountain weather often did. Clara had been checking her snares when the first fat snowflakes began falling, followed quickly by wind that bent the pines nearly horizontal. She'd barely made it back to the cabin before the blizzard hit in earnest, turning the world beyond her windows into a swirling wall of white. Such storms could last for days, and Clara had learned to use them for indoor tasks that required uninterrupted time. She was mending a torn quilt when she heard the sound, a heavy thud from the direction of the barn, followed by what might have been a groan, or it could have been the wind. Mountain storms played tricks with sound, making voices from creaking timber and footsteps from shifting snow. But something in the sound had made her pause, needle halfway through fabric. Clara had lived alone long enough to trust her instincts, and instinct told her this was no natural noise. Setting aside her sewing, she pulled on her heavy coat and wrapped a shawl around her head before venturing into the storm. The wind tried to steal her breath as she fought her way to the barn. Snow stung her exposed skin like tiny needles. The barn door, which she always secured with a heavy crossbar, hung slightly ajar. Clara's heart began beating faster. Nothing should have been able to move that door against the wind. She pushed. Inside, grateful for the shelter, but immediately aware that something was wrong. Her 2 horses, normally calm in their stalls, shifted nervously and rolled their eyes. The milk cow lowed anxiously from her corner. Animals knew when predators were near. Then Clara saw him. A man lay motionless in the hay, so large he seemed to fill the entire stall. Blood had soaked through his buckskin shirt and pooled beneath him, dark against the golden straw. His face was pale as winter sky, lips tinged blue with cold or blood loss. A crumpled, wanted poster lay partially visible. Beneath his massive frame, the corners stained crimson. Clara's first instinct was to run. Every story she'd ever heard about mountain men painted them as violent, unpredictable creatures, barely more civilized than the bears they hunted. This one was clearly on the wrong side of the law, judging by that poster. Harboring a wanted man could bring trouble she wasn't equipped to handle. But as she stood frozen in the doorway, snowflakes swirling around her skirts, another instinct proved stronger. This was a human being dying in her barn, and she was the only person who could help him. Clara had been raised to believe that mercy was not optional. It was the fundamental requirement of a Christian life. She knelt beside him, checking for signs of breathing. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements. When she placed her hand against his forehead, his skin burned with fever despite the cold. 3 bullet wounds were visible through his torn shirt, one high in his right shoulder, another in his left side just below the ribs, and a third that had creased his scalp, matting his dark hair with dried blood. The wanted poster beneath him bore a rough sketch and the name Silas McGraw, wanted for murder, $500 reward. Clara stared at it for a long moment, her practical mind warring with her compassionate heart. $500 was more money than she'd see in 2 years of careful living. It would buy supplies, security, perhaps even passage back to civilization, if she chose. But looking at his face, slack with unconsciousness and pain, Clara couldn't see a killer. She saw someone's son, someone who had once been a child learning to walk and speak and dream. Whatever crimes he might have committed, whatever dangers he might represent right now, he was simply a man who would die without her help. The decision made itself. Clara rose and began gathering supplies, clean cloth for bandages, her precious store of whiskey for cleaning wounds, needle and thread for stitching, blankets to fight the cold that was probably as dangerous as his injuries. Working by lamplight, while the storm raged outside, she began the delicate process of trying to save a stranger's life. The shoulder wound was the most serious. The bullet had passed clean through, but had torn muscle and possibly nicked bone. Clara had to cut away his shirt to examine it properly, revealing a chest and arms mapped with old scars. This man had survived violence before, many times. His body told stories of knives and claws, burns and blunt trauma that spoke of a life lived on the edge of survival. She cleaned each wound as thoroughly as she dared, fighting nausea as infection-tainted blood flowed freely. The whiskey made him groan and shift restlessly, but he didn't wake. Clara stitched what could be stitched, bandaged what couldn't, and wrapped him in every blanket she could spare. Through that first night, she stayed with him in the barn, checking his breathing, changing blood-soaked bandages, spooning water between his lips when fever made him delirious. He spoke in his unconsciousness, fragments of words that might have been names, warnings, or prayers. Once he called out clearly, "Sarah, get behind the trees," in a voice full of desperate urgency. Clara wondered who Sarah was. A wife? A daughter? Someone this dangerous man loved enough to protect even in his dreams. The storm lasted 3 days, giving Clara time to move him from the barn to her cabin, when it became clear he would need more intensive care. Getting a man his size from barn to house required ingenuity. She fashioned a travois from rope and branches, then used her horses to drag it through the snow. Every jolt made him groan, but consciousness remained elusive. In her cabin, Clara set up a makeshift sick room near the fireplace where she could keep him warm. She'd never tended wounds this serious, but practical experience with injured animals served her well. Keep the wounds clean, fight infection, maintain body temperature, provide fluids when possible. The rest was in God's hands. For 3 weeks, Clara lived in a strange, suspended reality. Her world narrowed to the space around his bed. Her days measured by the rhythm of his breathing. She read to him from her prayer book, hoping familiar words might anchor his spirit to his body. She changed bandages, spooned broth between slack lips, monitored the gradual retreat of infection from his wounds. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to improve. Color returned to his face. His breathing deepened and steadied. The wounds began showing healthy pink tissue instead of angry red inflammation. Clara found herself watching for these small signs of progress with an intensity that surprised her. She told herself it was simple Christian duty. Anyone would want to see their patient recover. But if she was honest, something more complex was developing. During those long hours of tending him, Clara had memorized his face. The strong jaw beneath its dark beard, the way his eyebrows drew together when pain troubled his dreams, the surprisingly long lashes that rested against his cheekbones. He was undeniably handsome in a rough, dangerous way that was entirely foreign to her experience. Thomas had been a gentleman, soft-spoken and civilized. This stranger represented something wilder, more primal. Clara found herself wondering what it would be like when those grey eyes finally opened, when that deep voice spoke to her directly instead of rambling through fever dreams. On the morning he finally woke, Clara was reading aloud from the book of Ruth, the story of a widow who chose loyalty over security. She became aware of his attention gradually, a change in his breathing, a subtle shift in the quality of his stillness. When she looked up from the pages, those grey eyes were watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. They studied each other in silence for a long moment. Clara saw intelligence in his gaze and something else, a measuring quality, as if he was cataloguing everything about her, filing away details for future reference. It should have made her nervous, but instead she felt oddly protected, as if she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, but carried absolute conviction. "I'll make you a mother before spring." The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, her heart hammering against her ribs. No proper response existed for such a statement. It was outrageous, presumptuous, completely inappropriate from a stranger she'd nursed back to health. Yet something in his eyes held her frozen, unable to flee or protest, as she should have. There was no mockery in his expression, no crude calculation. Instead, she saw intention backed by a will that had never learned to accept defeat. This was not an idle boast or desperate rambling. It was a promise, delivered with the gravity of a man who kept his word regardless of cost. Clara's face burned as Silas's words echoed in the small cabin. She stood abruptly, nearly dropping her prayer book, and busied herself with unnecessary tasks, stoking the fire, rearranging items on her shelf, anything to avoid looking at him directly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and impossible promises. "You need broth," she finally managed, her voice higher than usual. "You've had fever for days." Silas watched her move around the cabin with those unsettling grey eyes, tracking her movements like a predator studying prey. But when he spoke again, his tone was gentler, almost apologetic. "Didn't mean to shock you, Mom. Sometimes a man says what's in his heart without thinking about proper words." Clara paused in her busy work, surprised by his attempt to soften the moment. She'd expected crude insistence or arrogant assumption, not this careful retreat. When she finally looked at him, she saw exhaustion in his face, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from more than physical injury. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said quietly, offering the dignity of names to replace the awkwardness of his declaration. "Silas McGraw." He tried to shift position and winced, his hand moving to the bandages around his ribs. "Though I suspect you already know that." Clara's eyes went to the wanted poster she'd hidden beneath other papers on her table. Silas followed her gaze and nodded slowly. "Found that, did you? Wondered if you might." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Probably wondering if you're safe with a wanted man in your house." The question hung between them, honest and necessary. Clara had wondered exactly that during the long nights of nursing him, especially when his fever dreams had been violent and urgent. But watching him now, weak as a newborn colt, struggling just to stay upright against her pillows, she felt more curious than afraid. "The poster says murder," she said carefully. "Does." Silas met her eyes directly. "Says a lot of things. Question is whether you believe everything you read, or whether you judge a man by what you see yourself." Clara considered this as she ladled broth from the pot hanging over the fire. She'd seen him helpless, vulnerable, calling out warnings to protect someone named Sarah, even in his unconsciousness. She'd seen the careful way he'd tried to apologize for his shocking words. These weren't the actions of a cold-blooded killer. "I see a man who was shot 3 times and left to die," she said, bringing him a cup of the warm broth. "I see someone who fought hard to live, and you see someone foolish enough to make promises he's got no right making." Silas accepted the cup gratefully, his large hands dwarfing the delicate china. "But I meant what I said, Clara Whitmore. Don't know why yet, but I meant it. The use of her full name sent an unexpected shiver through her. Thomas had called her Clara Bird, making her name into something light and musical. This man spoke her name like it was something to be treasured, each syllable given proper weight and attention. Over the following days, a careful routine developed between them. Clara would bring him meals and check his bandages, maintaining the proper distance of a nurse tending a patient. Silas would accept her care with quiet gratitude, never presuming beyond what she offered, but his eyes followed her movements with unmistakable interest. He was a surprisingly considerate patient. Despite his size and fearsome reputation, he moved carefully in her small space, aware that his presence disrupted the order she'd built around her solitary life. When she helped him to the necessary, he apologized for the awkwardness. When she changed his bandages, he warned her if the pain made him likely to flinch or swear. "You don't have to be so careful," Clara told him on the fourth day, after he'd awakened. "This is frontier life, not a St. Louis parlor." Silas looked up from the wooden spoon he'd been examining, a simple piece Clara had carved herself during her first lonely winter. "Maybe not, but you deserve better than rough treatment from a man who owes you his life." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Clara had expected crude mountain manners, not this careful respect. She found herself lingering during their interactions, drawn into conversations that revealed depths she hadn't anticipated. "Where did you learn to carve?" he asked, turning the spoon in his massive hands with surprising delicacy. "Necessity," Clara replied. "I arrived here with city goods that broke or wore out quickly, had to learn to make what I needed. Good work, clean lines, proper balance." He set the spoon aside carefully. "My father taught me similar skills. Said a man who couldn't make his own tools would always be dependent on others." "Your father was a mountain man, too. Trapper, trader, sometimes scout for wagon trains. Spent his whole life in these mountains." Silas's expression grew distant. "Died when I was 17. Bear attack that went wrong." Clara saw pain in his face that had nothing to do with physical wounds. "I'm sorry, that must have been terrible." "Was, but he taught me everything he could before then. How to read weather, track game, survive winters that would kill most men." Silas looked at her directly. "How to recognize something worth protecting when you find it." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks again, but this time she didn't look away. Something was building between them, fragile as spring ice, but undeniably present. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed. She'd given him her wider one near the fireplace and listened to his steady breathing. For 3 years, she'd been the only human sound in this cabin. Now another heartbeat in rhythm with hers, another soul shared the space she'd claimed as sanctuary. The small wooden box on her bedside table seemed to weigh heavier in the darkness. Inside it lay her wedding ring, removed after Thomas's death and never replaced. She'd told herself it was practical. Working hands needed freedom from jewelry. But the truth was more complex. The ring represented a past she'd loved, but lost. Dreams that had died with fever and unfulfilled promises. Could she really trust her heart to another man? Especially one whose past remained largely mysterious, whose future seemed uncertain at best. Silas's promise echoed in her memory. "I'll make you a mother before spring." It was outrageous, impossible, presumptuous, yet something deep inside her responded to the certainty in his voice, the complete absence of doubt or calculation. When had anyone ever been so sure about her, so willing to stake their word on her worthiness? In the darkness, Clara found herself placing a hand over her flat stomach, wondering what it would feel like to carry life there. She'd tried for 3 years with Thomas, hoping and praying and consulting doctors who offered no answers beyond patience. The failure had been one more grief layered onto all the others when fever took him. But what if the problem hadn't been with her? What if this strange, dangerous man could give her what her gentle husband never could? The thought was scandalous, improper, completely contrary to everything she'd been taught about marriage and propriety. Yet it wouldn't leave her alone as she listened to Silas breathe in the darkness, this man who'd made impossible promises with the gravity of gospel truth. By his second week of recovery, Silas had grown restless with inactivity. Clara found him, attempting to split kindling one morning, moving carefully but determined to contribute something useful to the household that had saved his life. "You'll tear your stitches," she scolded, taking the axe from his hands. "Can't lay abed like an invalid while you do all the work," Silas replied. "Besides, I heal better when I'm moving." Clara looked at the neat pile of split wood he'd already accumulated. Each piece was cut to identical length, split clean and straight. Even weakened by injury, his skill with tools was obvious. "At least let me check your bandages first." She led him back inside, where morning light through the windows revealed how much stronger he'd grown. Color had returned to his face, and his movements, while still careful, had regained some of their natural grace. When she unwrapped the bandages around his ribs, she was pleased to see the wound healing cleanly, with no signs of infection. "You have gentle hands," Silas said quietly as she worked. "Firm when they need to be, but gentle," Clara tried to ignore. The way his voice made her pulse quicken. "I had to learn. Living alone means being your own doctor. More than that." Silas watched her face as she applied fresh bandages. "There's something in you that wants to heal things. Probably can't help yourself." His observation was more accurate than comfortable. Clara had always been drawn to injured creatures, birds with broken wings, wounded animals, people who carried pain they couldn't share. Thomas used to tease her about bringing home strays. "Maybe that's why God led me to find you," she said without thinking, then blushed at the admission. "You think God had a hand in this?" Silas's tone held genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "I think God works through ordinary people doing ordinary kindness." Clara secured the bandage with practiced efficiency. "Nothing extraordinary about finding someone who needs help and providing it. Plenty of people would have left me to die, or turned me in for that reward money." Clara had thought about the $500 many times during sleepless nights. It would solve numerous problems, provide security she couldn't achieve through her own efforts. But each time she imagined riding into town to claim it, something in her rebelled against the betrayal. "Blood money never brought anyone happiness," she said firmly. Silas caught her hand as she reached for the unused bandages, his large fingers closing gently around hers. "Most people would disagree with that. $500 could change your life." "I'd like my life the way it is." The words came out more breathless than she'd intended, partly because of his touch and partly because she'd realized they were true. Somewhere during these weeks of caring for him, her lonely cabin had begun feeling like a home again. "Do you?" Silas's thumb traced across her knuckles with careful precision. "Or do you just tell yourself that because wanting more seems too dangerous?" The question hit closer to truth than Clara was prepared to face. She pulled her hand free and busied herself putting away medical supplies. "I should start breakfast," but Silas wasn't finished. "I've been watching you, Clara, seeing how you move through this place like you're trying not to take up too much space, like you're apologizing for being alive. That's not true." But even as she protested, Clara recognized the accuracy of his observation. She had been making herself smaller, quieter, less significant with each passing year of solitude. "Then why haven't you hung pictures on these walls? Why don't you have flowers on your table, music in the evenings, all the things that make a house feel lived in instead of just survived in?" Clara turned to face him, surprised by his perceptiveness. "How do you know what I had before?" "Because I can see what you don't have now." Silas struggled to his feet, moving to the mantel where a few basic necessities sat in stark arrangement. No photographs, no decorations, no personal touches beyond what's absolutely necessary. "You're living like you're afraid to get comfortable." His words stung because they were true. Clara had stripped her life down to bare essentials, telling herself it was practical frontier living, but honesty forced her to admit she'd been protecting herself from hope, from the possibility of loss that came with caring too much about anything. "Maybe I learned not to get too attached to things that can be taken away." she said quietly. Silas turned to look at her, understanding dawning in his grey eyes. Someone hurt you. Badly. Life hurt me. Clara moved to the stove, needing the familiar ritual of preparing food. I'm not the first woman to lose a husband, won't be the last. But you decided it was safer to stop living than risk loving again. The accusation, gently spoken but devastatingly accurate, made Clara's hands still on the coffee pot. She thought she was being practical, self-sufficient, admirably independent, but Silas saw through her careful arrangements to the fear underneath. I'm living, she said defensively. You're surviving. There's a difference. Over the following days, Silas began making subtle changes to Clara's carefully ordered space. He carved a simple wooden flower from pine scraps and left it on her table. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her door that she'd grown accustomed to ignoring. Most significantly, he began cooking meals, simple but flavorful food that required her to sit and enjoy rather than simply consume for fuel. Where did you learn to cook? Clara asked, watching him turn venison and wild onions into something that smelled like celebration. 30 years of feeding myself, Silas replied, adjusting seasonings with the confidence of long practice. Man gets tired of charred meat and boiled beans. The meal he prepared was a revelation. Clara had forgotten that food could be pleasure as well as necessity. She found herself lingering over each bite, savoring flavors that were complex and satisfying. This is wonderful, she said, meaning it completely. Good food is one of life's reliable pleasures, Silas replied. Shame to waste it on anything less than your best effort. After dinner, he surprised her again by producing a hand-carved wooden spoon from his coat pocket. It was beautiful work, smooth as silk, perfectly balanced, decorated with subtle patterns that caught the firelight. For you, he said simply, placing it beside her plate. Clara picked up the spoon, marveling at its craftsmanship. When did you make this? Evenings, while you were reading. Silas watched her examine his work. Hands need something to do during healing time. The spoon represented hours of careful work, attention to detail that spoke of genuine care. Clara realized this was his way of contributing, of giving her something beautiful, simply because she deserved beauty in her life. It's too fine for everyday use, she protested. No such thing, Silas said firmly. You're worth fine things every day, not just special occasions. That night, Clara held the wooden spoon as she lay in bed, feeling its smooth surface warm under her touch. No one had made anything specifically for her, since Thomas carved her a jewelry box during their courtship. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be the focus of someone's creative attention, to be considered worthy of time and skill freely given. The spoon was more than a utensil. It was a declaration that her comfort mattered, that her daily life deserved enhancement rather than mere endurance. For the first time in 3 years, Clara fell asleep smiling. 3 weeks into Silas's recovery, the first signs of spring began appearing in the high country. Ice crystals on the windows grew smaller each morning, and Clara could hear water running. Beneath frozen creek beds, the mountains promise that winter's grip was finally loosening. But with the changing season came reminders that their isolated sanctuary couldn't last forever. Clara noticed the changes in Silas's behavior before she consciously understood their meaning. He'd begun spending time at her windows, studying the landscape with the focused attention of a man reading dangerous text. His hand went often to where his weapons would normally hang, fingers closing on empty air before he remembered they were stored in her root cellar. "You're worried about something," she said one morning, finding him standing motionless at the east-facing window. Silas didn't deny it. Winter kept us safe. Spring makes travel possible again. Travel for whom? People who might still be looking for me. He turned from the window, his expression serious. That gang didn't give up easy. They've probably been waiting for the snows to clear. Clara felt her stomach tighten. She'd grown so comfortable in their domestic routine that she'd almost forgotten The circumstances that brought him here, how long do you think we have? Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be days. Depends on how patient they are, how much that reward money means to them. The compass in Silas's pocket seemed to weigh heavier as he spoke. His father's brass compass had guided him through countless wilderness journeys, always pointing toward purpose and direction, even when the way forward seemed impossible. Now it pointed toward a choice that would define both their futures. I should leave, he said quietly. Every day I stay puts you in more danger. And every day you leave too soon risks your life, Clara replied with more force than she'd intended. Those wounds aren't fully healed. You're still weak enough to get you killed if they find me here. Silas's jaw was set in lines she'd learned, meant his mind was made up. Better I take my chances on the trail than wait for trouble to come to your door. Clara turned away from him, ostensibly to tend the fire, but really to hide the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Somewhere during these weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, she'd begun thinking of Silas as permanent. Not a patient recovering in her home, but a partner building something lasting with her. The realization of how much she'd invested in this impossible situation hit her like cold water. She was a respectable widow who'd taken in a wanted man, nursed him back to health, and somehow convinced herself they had a future together. It was foolish beyond description. Maybe you're right, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Maybe it would be better if you left. But Silas heard something in her tone that made him cross the room to stand behind her. Clara, she didn't. And turn around, couldn't face him while her emotions were so close to the surface. I have winter preserves to check, bread to bake, normal life to get back to. Look at me. The quiet command in his voice compelled obedience. Clara turned reluctantly, trying to keep her expression neutral. But Silas saw through her careful composure immediately. You don't want me to go. It wasn't a question, and Clara couldn't bring herself to lie. What I want isn't relevant. What's practical, what's safe, what's proper, those things matter more. They? Silas stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the pine and leather scent that had become familiar, comforting. Or are you just afraid to admit you care what happens to me? Of course I care. The words burst out before she could stop them. I've spent 3 weeks keeping you alive. I've used my medical supplies, my food stores, risked my safety and reputation. Of course I care what happens to you. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. They were venturing into territory she wasn't prepared to navigate, feelings she'd tried to keep carefully contained. I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to say what's true. Not what's proper or practical, but what's true. The intensity in his grey eyes made her breath catch. Clara had spent 3 years avoiding truth that might lead to pain, settling for safety over honesty. But something in Silas's presence made pretense impossible. The truth is, I'm terrified, she whispered. Terrified of caring about someone again. Terrified of losing someone again. Terrified of wanting things I can't have. What things? You know what things. Clara's voice was barely audible. The things you promised me that first day. Family, future, purpose beyond mere survival. Silas reached up to cup her face in his large hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. Those aren't things you can't have, Clara. They're things you've been afraid to reach for. And what if I reach and lose everything again? What if you don't reach and lose everything anyway? His voice was soft but relentless. You're already living like you've lost everything that matters. At least wanting something gives you a chance of getting it. Before Clara could respond, Silas leaned down and kissed her. It was nothing like the gentle, respectful kisses Thomas had given her during their courtship. This was honest desire, raw and uncompromising, from a man who'd never learned to hide his intentions behind polite convention. Clara's first instinct was to pull away, to retreat into the safety of propriety and distance. But her body had been starved for human touch for 3 long years, and Silas's kiss awakened hungers she'd tried to forget existed. She found herself kissing him back with a desperation that shocked her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Clara felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the intensity of her response. "This is madness." "Maybe," Silas agreed, "but it's honest madness. Better than pretending you don't feel what you feel." That evening, they sat closer together by the fire than they had before, the air between them changed by acknowledged desire. Clara found herself acutely aware of Silas's physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his hands as he whittled, the way firelight caught in his dark hair. "Tell me about Sarah," she said quietly. Silas's hands stilled on the piece of wood he was shaping. "What about her? You called her name when you were fevered, warned her to get behind trees. She's important to you." For a long moment, Silas didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried old pain. "Sarah was my wife. Died in a Cheyenne raid 5 years ago." Clara felt something twist in her chest, part sympathy, part jealousy she had no right to feel. "I'm sorry." That must have been devastating. It was. Silas's knife resumed its careful work. "Lost our unborn child with her. Boy, according to the medicine woman who tried to save them both." The admission explained so much. His promise to make her a mother, his intensity about family, the deep loneliness she'd sensed in him from the beginning. "Is that why you made that promise to me? Because of what you lost?" Silas looked at her, directly. "Made that promise because of what I found. You saved my life, Clara. More than that, you made me remember what life's worth living for." That night, Clara lay awake thinking about courage. The courage to reach for happiness despite the risk of loss, to open her heart despite the certainty of eventual pain. Everyone she'd ever loved had been taken from her, but maybe that was exactly why love mattered so much when it appeared again. In the darkness, she made a decision that would change everything. The decision Clara made in the darkness proved easier to contemplate than to act upon. For 3 days after their kiss, she found herself watching Silas with new awareness while struggling to find words for feelings that seemed too large for language. He seemed to understand her internal battle, giving her space while making his own feelings unmistakably clear through gentle touches and meaningful glances. The breakthrough came on a morning when late winter snow fell softly outside, creating the kind of hushed intimacy that made the cabin feel separate from the rest of the world. Clara was mending a torn shirt, one of Thomas's that she'd been unable to bring herself to discard, when Silas looked up from oiling his knife. "You're thinking about him," he said quietly. Clara's hands stilled on the fabric. "Yes, want to." Tell me about him." The invitation surprised her. Thomas had become a subject she avoided, too painful to discuss and too private to share. But something in Silas's tone suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. He was gentle, she began slowly, kind in ways that made everyday life easier. "He never raised his voice, never made me feel foolish for being afraid of storms or missing my family." Silas nodded, encouraging her to continue. "We tried for 3 years to have children, saw doctors in St. Louis, tried every remedy anyone suggested. Nothing worked." Clara's voice grew quieter. "When he died, part of me wondered if God was punishing me for some sin I couldn't identify. Why else would I be denied the children I wanted so desperately?" "Maybe because you were meant to have different children with a different man," Silas said gently. Clara looked up, surprised by his certainty. "You sound very sure of that." "I am sure." Silas set down his knife and moved to sit beside her on the small bench. "Sometimes life has to take things away before it can give you what you're really meant to have." His proximity made Clara's pulse quicken, but she forced herself to focus on the conversation. "That seems cruel, maybe. Or maybe it's just how growth works. Old things have to die before new ones can take root." Silas gestured toward the window, where snow was melting off pine branches in the warming air. Trees drop their old needles to make room for new growth. Ground lies fallow before it produces the best crops. Clara considered this, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of Thomas's shirt. "You think my marriage was just preparation for something else?" I think you learned how to love through that marriage. Now you're ready to love differently, more fully. Silas's hand covered hers on the fabric. Question is whether you trust yourself enough to try. The touch of his hand sent warmth up her arm. Clara had been fighting her attraction to this man for weeks, telling herself it was gratitude or loneliness or the isolation playing tricks with her emotions. But sitting here in the quiet intimacy of snowfall, she could no longer deny the truth. I want to try, she whispered, but I don't know how to be with someone like you, someone like me. Dangerous, complicated, someone who makes promises that sound impossible but feels absolutely certain. Silas smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Clara, you've been living alone in the wilderness for 3 years, nursing wounded strangers back to health, surviving challenges. That would break most people. You're far more dangerous than you give yourself credit for. The observation made her laugh, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. I suppose surviving here does require a certain kind of courage. More than courage, requires someone willing to fight for what matters. Silas's thumb traced across her knuckles. I've been watching you fight for my life these past weeks. Made me wonder what you'd be capable of if you were fighting for your own happiness. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of restrictions she'd placed on her own heart. She thought of her mother's locket, hidden in her bedroom drawer, along with the pressed flower from her childhood home. The flower had traveled thousands of miles, survived countless hardships, just as Clara had. Maybe it was time to stop merely surviving and start truly living. There's something I need to tell you, she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. About why Thomas and I never had children. Silas waited patiently, sensing the importance of what she was about to share. The doctors said the problem was with me, something about my body that made pregnancy unlikely. Clara's cheeks warmed with embarrassment, but she forced herself to continue. I need you to know that before you make any more promises about making me a mother. Instead of disappointment or withdrawal, Silas's expression grew more tender. Did the doctors run their tests on your husband too? No. In those days they assumed the woman was always the problem. Silas shook his head. Doctors don't know everything, Clara. Hell, they don't know much of anything about how bodies really work, especially women's bodies. But what if they were right? What if I can't give you children? Silas lifted her chin with one finger, making her meet his eyes. Then we'll love whatever children God sends us, orphans who need families, children from broken homes, maybe my own daughter if I can ever find her again. Your daughter? Clara's heart stopped. You have a daughter. The words hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire. Silas's face went carefully blank, and Clara realized he'd revealed something he hadn't intended to share. He corrected quietly. Lost track of her after Sarah died. Her grandmother took her east, wouldn't tell me where. Clara felt her world tilt sideways. A daughter. Silas had a living child somewhere, a piece of his heart that belonged to someone else entirely. Everything about their situation suddenly seemed more complicated, more fraught with potential heartbreak. How old is she? Clara managed to ask. 12 now, would be 12. Silas's voice carried a pain that made Clara's chest ache in sympathy. Haven't seen her since the funeral. Her grandmother blamed me for Sarah's death, said I was too dangerous to raise a child. Was she right? The question came out harsher than Clara intended, but she needed to know. If Silas truly was too dangerous for his own daughter, what did that mean for her? Maybe, Silas admitted with devastating honesty. My life has been violent, unpredictable, but I loved that little girl more than my own breath. Would have done anything to keep her safe. Clara saw the truth of it in his face, the raw grief of a father forcibly separated from his child. Her earlier jealousy transformed into something deeper, more complex. This wasn't competition for his affections. This was a wound that had never healed, a love that demanded understanding rather than resentment. What's her name? She asked softly. Emma Rose McGraw. Silas's voice grew tender with memory. She had Sarah's dark eyes, but my stubborn chin could outstubborn a mule when she set her mind to something. Clara imagined a dark-eyed girl with Silas's determined jaw and felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Not jealousy, but a fierce, protective instinct for a child she'd never met. "Maybe someday we can find her," she said quietly. "We." Silas looked at her with surprise and something that might have been hope. "If you want that, if you want me to be part of that search." Clara took a deep breath, committing to a future she couldn't fully envision. "I meant what I said about trusting you. That includes trusting your love for your daughter." For a moment, Silas looked as though she'd given him an unexpected gift. Then he leaned down and kissed her again, this time with a gentleness that spoke of gratitude as much as desire. That night, when Clara finally invited Silas to share her bed, it was with full knowledge of the complexities ahead. He loved her, but he also loved a daughter he'd lost. She wanted children, but might not be able to bear them. They were both carrying wounds that might never fully heal. But as Silas held her in the darkness, his large hands mapping the contours of her body with reverent attention, Clara discovered that love didn't require perfection. It required only the courage to reach for happiness despite uncertainty, to build something beautiful on the foundation of shared hope and mutual trust. When morning came, they would face whatever challenges awaited. For now, in the intimate darkness of her cabin, Clara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of family, future, and love that could survive even the harshest wilderness. 2 weeks after they'd become lovers, Clara discovered the letter while gathering Silas's belongings to wash them properly. His clothes had been bloodstained and torn when she'd first found him, hastily patched with whatever materials she had available. Now that he was fully recovered, she wanted to mend them properly, with care befitting the man who wore them. She was checking his coat pockets for items that shouldn't go in the wash water when her fingers encountered a piece of paper, folded small and tucked deep into an inner pocket. The paper was soft with age and handling, obviously something he'd carried for years. Clara's first instinct was to set it aside unexamined. Everyone deserved privacy regarding their personal correspondence, but as she pulled the letter free, a dark stain on one corner caught her attention. Blood, the same blood that had soaked his clothes the night she'd found him dying. The letter had been important enough that he'd kept it close, even during a life-or-death gun battle. Clara told herself to put it aside, to respect Silas's privacy. But the letter seemed to call to her, representing some essential piece of the puzzle that was this complicated man she'd fallen in love with. Before she could reconsider, she unfolded the paper and began to read. The handwriting was feminine, careful, the work of someone who'd been taught proper penmanship. The date at the top was 3 months old. "Mr. McGraw," the letter began formally, "I am writing to inform you of developments regarding your daughter, Emma Rose McGraw, currently in my custody. As you know, I have opposed any contact between you and the child since her mother's unfortunate death, believing your lifestyle too dangerous and unpredictable for proper child rearing." Clara's hands began to tremble as the implications hit her. Not only did Silas have a daughter, but someone had been deliberately keeping him from her. The letter continued in the same coldly formal tone. "However, Emma has recently begun exhibiting behaviors that concern me greatly. She speaks constantly of finding you, has attempted to run away twice in the past month, and grows increasingly defiant of my authority. The child seems to have inherited your stubborn disposition, along with other less desirable traits. I am therefore prepared to reconsider the arrangement, provided you can demonstrate stability and proper living conditions. If you can prove you've abandoned your previous dangerous pursuits and established a respectable household, I might be persuaded to allow supervised visits." The letter was signed Mrs. Catherine Donovan and included an address in Denver. At the bottom, in a child's careful script, someone had added, "Papa, I miss you. Please come find me. Love, Emma." Clara stared at the childish handwriting until her vision blurred. The letter was 3 months old. For 3 months, Silas had been carrying this offer of reconciliation with his daughter, this hope of rebuilding the family that had been torn from him, and he'd said nothing to her about it. She heard his footsteps on the porch and quickly refolded the letter, but not quickly enough. When Silas entered the cabin, he took one look at her face and knew immediately what had happened. "You read it," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to." Clara's voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "It fell out of your coat pocket. I saw the blood on it and thought you had a right to know what I was keeping from you." There was no anger in his voice, only a weary resignation that was somehow worse than rage would have been. "Don't I?" The question burst out before Clara could stop it. "We've shared a bed, Silas. You've made promises about our future. Did you think I'd never find out you have a daughter who's looking for you?" Silas sat down heavily in the chair by the fire, suddenly looking older than his years. "Didn't know how to tell you." "How to tell me what? That you've been lying to me for weeks?" "Didn't lie, just didn't know how to explain something I haven't figured out myself." Silas looked at her directly, his grey eyes full of pain. "That letter arrived the day before I tracked down the Morrison gang. Been carrying it ever since, trying to decide what to do." Clara felt some of her anger cool, replaced by confusion. "What's to decide? She's your daughter. She wants to see you. She wants to see the father she remembers, not the man I've become." Silas's voice was rough with emotion. "When Sarah died, I went a little crazy. Spent 5 years tracking down every member of that Cheyenne war party, making them pay for what they took from me. By the time I was done, I wasn't fit company for a child or anyone else." The admission hung between them like smoke from a bitter fire. Clara began to understand the true scope of what she'd stumbled into, the wanted poster. That's what the murder charge is really about. Killing men who'd already been sentenced. By tribal council, but not by territorial law. Silas's laugh was completely without humor. "Turns out revenge doesn't care about legal niceties." Clara sank into the other chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. Everything she thought she knew about. Their situation had just shifted. "So when you made that promise to me about making me a mother, I meant it, every word." Silas leaned forward, his expression intense. "But I also knew there was a good chance I'd never live long enough to keep it. Figured you deserved whatever happiness I could give you, even if it was temporary." "And what about Emma? What about your promise to her?" "What promise?" Silas's voice cracked with pain. "I haven't seen that child in 5 years. Haven't been allowed to write to her, visit her, have any contact whatsoever. For all I know, she's better off without me." Clara looked at the letter in her hands, reading again the childish plea. "Papa, I miss you. Please come find me." She doesn't think so. She's 12 years old. What does she know about what's good for her? She knows she misses her father. Clara's voice was sharper than she'd intended. She knows she's been separated from the person who should love her most in the world. Silas flinched as if she'd slapped him. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't dream about her every night? Wonder what she looks like now, whether she's happy, whether she even remembers me? Then why haven't you gone to Denver? Why are you here with me instead of with her?" The question lay between them like a challenge. Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might provide answers. "Because I'm afraid," he finally admitted. "Afraid she'll take one look at what I've become and wish I'd stayed away. Afraid her grandmother is right about me being too dangerous for a child. Afraid I'll disappoint her the way I disappointed her mother." Clara felt her anger dissolve, replaced by something deeper and more complex. Here was the truth, beneath his confident promises and easy certainty. A man paralyzed by the fear of failing someone he loved more than life itself. "How did you disappoint Sarah? Couldn't keep her safe." The words came out raw, scraped from some deep place of pain. "Made too many enemies, lived too close to violence. When the war party came, they came because of me, because of things I'd done. Sarah died because she was married to me." Clara began to understand the true weight of what Silas carried. Not just grief for his lost wife and child, but guilt that had been eating at him for 5 years. That's why you haven't tried to contact Emma. You think you'll get her killed too. Men like me don't get to have families, Clara. We're too dangerous, too marked by violence. Emma's better off in Denver with her grandmother, learning to be a lady, than she would be running around the wilderness with a wanted man. And what about me? Clara's voice was quiet but steady. Am I better off without you too? Silas looked at her with such pain in his eyes that Clara's heart contracted. You're different. You're strong enough to make your own choices, old enough to understand the risks. Emma's just a child. Emma's a child who needs her father. Clara folded the letter carefully and held it out to him. Maybe the question isn't whether you're good enough for her. Maybe the question is whether you love her enough to try to be. Silas stared at the letter but didn't take it. What if I fail her again? What if you don't try and regret it for the rest of your life? Clara kept her hand extended, holding the letter between them like an offering. I can't make this decision for you, Silas, but I can tell you that love without risk isn't really love at all. It's just fear, wearing love's mask. For a long moment, they sat in silence while the fire crackled and the weight of impossible choices pressed down on them both. Finally, Silas reached out and took the letter from Clara's hand. If I go to Denver, he said quietly, I want you to come with me. Clara's heart stopped. What? If I'm going to try to be the father Emma deserves, I want to do it with someone who understands what family really means. Silas's eyes met hers directly. That promise I made you about making you a mother, maybe it was meant to include Emma, too. The possibility hung between them, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Clara thought of the 12-year-old girl she'd never met, longing for her father. She thought of Silas, paralyzed by fear of failing again. She thought of herself, afraid to reach for the family she'd always wanted. We'd be taking an enormous risk, she said finally. Yes, we might lose everything. We might gain everything, too. Silas's voice carried the same certainty that had marked his original promise to her. Question is whether you trust me enough to find out. Clara looked at this man who'd stumbled bleeding into her barn and changed her entire world. In 6 weeks, he'd taught her to live instead of merely survive, to reach for happiness instead of settling for safety. Now he was asking her to trust him with the biggest risk of all, the possibility of a family that included not just the children they might have together, but the child he'd already lost. When do we leave for Denver? She asked. The decision to travel to Denver transformed their quiet mountain sanctuary into a staging ground for an uncertain future. Over the following week, Clara and Silas prepared for a journey that would test everything they'd built together. The child's handmade doll that Silas produced from his belongings served as a constant reminder of what awaited them, a tangible connection to the daughter he'd lost and hoped to reclaim. The doll was crude by city standards, made from scraps of fabric and corn husks, but it had been crafted with obvious love. Emma had sewn on button eyes and embroidered a small mouth, creating a face that was somehow both innocent and determined. The dress was carefully stitched from blue calico, with tiny flowers picked out in yellow thread. She made this for her. Mother? Silas explained, holding the doll with infinite care. Sarah was pregnant when she died. Emma wanted to make sure her baby sister had a proper toy. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she examined the doll's sweet face. She was going to be a good big sister. She was good at everything she tried. Smart as a whip, stubborn as her old man, but gentle with anything smaller than herself. Silas's voice carried 5 years of accumulated grief. Used to follow me around the mountains, learning to track and identify plants. Could spot deer sign. Before most grown men, you taught her to survive in the wilderness? Taught her to respect it. Wilderness isn't something you survive. It's something you learn to live with. Emma understood that better than most adults. Silas set the doll carefully on the mantel, where it seemed to watch over their preparations. But her grandmother thinks such knowledge is inappropriate for young ladies. Clara heard the frustration beneath his words. Mrs. Donovan wants Emma to be something she's not. wants her to be what society expects: quiet, obedient, concerned, with proper clothes and proper manners rather than proper skills. Silas moved to the window, studying the landscape with the restless attention that had marked his behavior since they'd decided to travel. Nothing wrong with manners, but they won't keep you alive if trouble comes. And trouble might come. It wasn't a question. Both of them understood that traveling to Denver meant exposing themselves to dangers they'd avoided in their mountain isolation. The Morrison gang might still be active. Law enforcement might be looking for Silas. Mrs. Donovan might refuse to let them see Emma at all. Probably will come, Silas agreed. Question is whether we're prepared for it when it does. Their preparations took on the methodical character of a military campaign. Silas cleaned and oiled his weapons, checking each mechanism with practiced efficiency. Clara inventoried their supplies, calculating what they'd need for the journey and what they could afford to carry. They studied maps by candlelight, plotting routes that would minimize their exposure while still allowing reasonable travel time. But beneath the practical preparations lay emotional challenges that couldn't be solved with maps and supplies. Clara found herself wrestling with doubts that multiplied in the darkness when sleep proved elusive. "What if she doesn't like me?" she asked one night, voicing the fear that had been building for days. Silas turned in their narrow bed to face her. "Why wouldn't she like you? I'm a stranger. I'm taking her father's attention. I'm proof that he's moved on from her mother." Clara stared at the ceiling, where shadows from the dying fire danced across wooden beams. "I'm everything that represents change in a life that's already been disrupted too much. Or you're everything that represents stability in a life that's had too little of it." Silas's hand found hers beneath the quilts. "Emma's spent 5 years being told her father is dangerous, unpredictable, unfit for civilized company. Then you show up, a woman who chose to love him anyway, who saw something worth saving in him. That might be exactly what she needs to see. What if Mrs. Donovan refuses to let us see her? Then we'll find another way." The certainty in Silas's voice was absolute. "I'm done letting other people decide what's best for my daughter." Clara squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his determination. "What if the law comes for you before we can establish any kind of custody arrangement? Then you'll take Emma and disappear until things settle down." Silas's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than planning. "For his potential arrest or death, I won't leave you. You will if it means keeping Emma safe." Silas's grip on her hand tightened. "That's not negotiable, Clara. Whatever happens to me, Emma comes first." The conversation revealed the depths of Silas's commitment to his daughter, but it also highlighted the precarious nature of their situation. They were essentially planning to steal a child from her legal guardian, using nothing but moral authority and paternal rights that might not be recognized by law. "We could write to Mrs. Donovan first," Clara suggested. "Explain that you've settled down, established a respectable household. Maybe she'd be willing to negotiate without forcing a confrontation." Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Might work, or might give her time to disappear with Emma before we can reach Denver." Would she do that? Woman who'd keep a child from her father for 5 years would probably do whatever she thought was necessary to maintain control. Silas's voice carried bitter experience. "Catherine Donovan thinks she's protecting Emma from me. In her mind, that justifies any action." Clara tried to imagine the other woman's perspective, a grandmother who genuinely believed she was saving her granddaughter from a dangerous father. But good intentions didn't excuse the pain that separation had caused both Silas and Emma. "Maybe we can convince her she was wrong," Clara said. "Show her that you've changed, that you can provide the stability Emma needs." "Maybe, but we need to be prepared for the possibility that convincing won't be enough." The implications of that statement hung between them in the darkness. If Mrs. Donovan couldn't be convinced to voluntarily return Emma, they might have to take more direct action. The thought made Clara's stomach clench with anxiety. Their final week of preparation took on an urgency that couldn't be explained by mere travel logistics. Spring was advancing rapidly, and with it came the increasing likelihood that the Morrison gang would resume their search for Silas. Every day they delayed in reaching Denver was another day of risk for all of them. Clara found herself memorizing details of their cabin life with the intensity of someone creating a mental museum. The way morning light fell across their breakfast table, the sound of Silas humming tunelessly while he worked, the particular warmth of their bed when he pulled her close in the pre-dawn darkness. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving something precious behind, something they might never recover. "Having second thoughts?" Silas asked, finding her standing motionless in the doorway on their last morning. "Third and fourth thoughts," Clara admitted, "but not changing my mind." "Good, because I need you with me for this." Silas moved to stand beside her, both of them looking out at the valley that had sheltered their unlikely romance. "Emma's going to need someone who understands what it means to start over, to build something new from broken pieces." "Is that what we're doing? Building something new?" "We're building a family." Silas's arm went around her waist, solid and reassuring. "Might not look like other families, might not follow conventional rules, but it'll be ours." Clara leaned into his strength, drawing courage from his certainty. "What if we're making a terrible mistake? Then we'll make it together and figure out how to fix it together." Silas turned her to face him, his grey eyes serious. "I've lived 5 years afraid to risk anything that mattered. You've lived 3 years afraid to want anything that might hurt. Maybe it's time we both stopped being afraid." That afternoon, they loaded their belongings into Clara's wagon and began the journey toward Denver. The mountain cabin that had sheltered their love affair disappeared behind them as they descended into valleys that would lead eventually to civilization, confrontation, and the uncertain future of a 12-year-old girl who'd been waiting 5 years for her father to come home. As they traveled, Clara found herself returning again and again to the image of Emma's doll, with its button eyes and determined little face. Somewhere ahead of them waited a child who'd made that doll with her own hands, stitched love into every seam, created beauty from scraps and hope. A child who'd inherited her father's stubborn determination and her mother's gentle heart. A child who might complete the family Clara had never dared to dream possible. The doll rode with them in the wagon, a talisman of hope and a reminder of what they stood to gain or lose in the confrontation ahead. Each mile that carried them closer to Denver also carried them closer to a reckoning that would determine whether love was strong enough to overcome law, whether determination could triumph over doubt, and whether 3 damaged people could create something whole together. Behind them, the mountains held their silence. Ahead, the city waited with all its possibilities and perils, and between them, Clara and Silas traveled toward a future that would test everything they discovered about love, family, and the courage required to fight for both. They were 3 days out from Denver when the Morrison gang found them. Clara had been driving the wagon while Silas scouted ahead, a precaution they'd maintained since leaving the mountains. The trail wound through a narrow valley between 2 ridges, exactly the kind of terrain Silas had warned her to watch for, places where ambush was not just possible but probable. She heard the gunshot before she saw anything else, a sharp crack that echoed off the valley walls. The horses reared and whinnied in terror, nearly overturning the wagon before Clara could get them under control. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked frantically for Silas, finding him crouched behind a boulder 50 yards ahead, his father's Winchester rifle already in his hands. "Clara!" His voice carried clearly across the distance. "Get the wagon into those trees and stay down." She didn't hesitate, turning the horses toward a stand of pine trees that offered the best available cover. As she fought to control the panicking animals, she caught her first glimpse of their attackers, 5 men on horseback, spread across the valley floor in a formation designed to prevent escape. The man in the center was obviously their leader, sitting his horse with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to inspiring fear. Even at a distance, Clara could see the cruel cast of his features, the way he held his rifle like it was an extension of his own arm. This had to be Jake Morrison himself, the man whose gang had terrorized the territory for months. Silas McGraw. Morrison's voice boomed across the valley. "You've led us a hell of a chase, but it ends here." "Depends on your definition of ending," Silas called back, never taking his eyes off the riders. Morrison laughed, the sound carrying an edge of genuine anticipation. "Oh, it ends with you dead, mountain man. Question is whether your woman dies." Quick or slow, Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd known this moment might come, but the reality of facing armed killers was far different from imagining it in the safety of their cabin. Her hands shook as she reached for the shotgun Silas had insisted she carry, checking to make sure both barrels were loaded. "You've got 30 seconds to ride away," Silas shouted. "After that, I start shooting back. You're outnumbered 5-1, McGraw. Even you ain't that good. Want to find out?" Clara could see the tension in Silas's shoulders, the way he held himself perfectly still while calculating angles and distances. This was the man the stories were told about. Not the gentle lover who'd carved her wooden spoons, but the deadly predator who'd survived 30 years in the wilderness by being faster and smarter than anything that hunted him. The transformation was both terrifying and magnificent. Gone was every trace of domesticity, replaced by a lethal focus that made the air itself seem dangerous. When Silas moved, it was with the fluid precision of a man who'd never missed a shot that mattered. His first bullet took Morrison's hat clean, off his head, close enough to part his hair. The second shattered the rifle stock of the man to Morrison's left before he could bring it to bear. The third and fourth shots came so quickly they sounded like one, dropping 2 horses and sending their riders scrambling for cover. Clara had never seen anything like it. Silas worked the lever of his Winchester with mechanical precision, each shot placed exactly where he intended, each movement calculated to maintain his advantage. This wasn't wild shooting or lucky marksmanship. This was surgical violence applied. By a master craftsman, Morrison's remaining men returned fire, but they were shooting uphill at a target who'd already moved to new cover. Their bullets sparked off rocks and splintered trees, but Silas seemed to anticipate each shot, staying one step ahead of their aim. "God damn you, McGraw!" Morrison roared. "Stand and fight like a man!" "I am fighting like a man," Silas called back. "You're the ones fighting like amateurs." Clara watched in fascination and terror as Silas systematically dismantled their attackers. A shot that disabled another rifle, a bullet that creased a shoulder, sending its owner howling for cover. Each precise application of force designed to demoralize rather than simply kill. But the gang members were experienced fighters themselves, and they began adapting to Silas's tactics. 2 of them split off, circling wide to flank his position. Clara realized with growing horror that even Silas couldn't watch all directions at once. She made her decision without conscious thought, rising from behind the wagon with her shotgun ready. When the flanking riders came within range, she let them have both barrels, the twin blasts echoing like thunder in the narrow valley. The double load of buckshot didn't kill either man, but it didn't need to. One horse went down screaming, pinning, its rider beneath it. The other mount shied violently, throwing its rider into a patch of thorny scrub brush that left him cursing and bleeding. "Good shooting!" Silas called, genuine pride in his voice. But their moment of triumph was brief. Morrison and his remaining men were regrouping, and Clara could see the cold calculation in their leader's eyes. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Morrison's face had gone dark with rage as he realized his men were being systematically outfought by a single mountain man and a woman with a shotgun. He barked orders to his remaining fighters, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a leader who'd never learned to accept defeat gracefully. "Forget the fancy shooting," he snarled. "Rush them. They can't reload fast enough to stop all of us." Clara felt her blood turn to ice water. 3 men were preparing to charge their position simultaneously, coming from different angles to overwhelm. Their defenses: she had 2 shells in her shotgun and time to reload once if she was lucky. Silas was deadly accurate, but even he couldn't stop 3 riders charging at full gallop. "Clara!" Silas's voice cut through her rising panic. "When they charge, you take the one coming straight up the middle. I'll handle the flankers. What if I miss?" "You won't miss. You're fighting for Emma now, remember? For our family." The reminder steadied her more than any amount of reassurance could have. Clara thought of the 12-year-old girl waiting in Denver, the daughter who'd been separated from her father for 5 years through no fault of her own. She thought of the doll with its button eyes and determined little face, created by a child who still believed her father would come home. Morrison raised his hand, and Clara knew the charge was seconds away. She checked her grip on the shotgun, forcing her breathing to slow despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Silas had taught her to shoot during their weeks together, and she'd proven surprisingly accurate, but shooting at targets was vastly different from shooting at men who were trying to kill her. "Now!" Morrison roared, spurring his horse forward. The 3 riders came at them like thunder incarnate, their horses' hooves pounding against the rocky ground, dust rising in clouds behind them. Clara had perhaps 10 seconds before they'd be close enough for pistol fire to become deadly accurate. She chose her target, Morrison himself, charging straight toward the wagon with a pistol in each hand. If she could stop him, the others might lose heart. If she failed, he'd ride right over her position and finish this fight at point-blank range. Clara waited until she could see the hatred in Morrison's eyes, then squeezed both triggers simultaneously. The shotgun's brutal recoil drove her back against the wagon, but she saw Morrison's horse stumble and go down, throwing its rider hard against the rocky ground. To her left and right, Silas's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, both flanking. Riders pitched from their saddles, though Clara couldn't tell whether they were dead or merely wounded. The valley fell suddenly quiet, except for the groaning of injured men and the labored breathing of wounded horses. Clara fumbled for more shells, her hands shaking with reaction. Morrison was still alive, crawling toward cover behind his fallen horse, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. She'd hit him, but not cleanly enough to end the threat. "Stay down," Silas called, moving from his position with fluid grace. "This isn't finished yet." Morrison had managed to retrieve one of his pistols and was trying to steady it for a shot, but his vision was clearly affected by the head wound, and his movements were uncoordinated. When he finally fired, the bullet went wide by several feet. Silas approached with the calm patience of a man who'd faced death too many times to be hurried by it. "It's over, Morrison. Your men are down, your horse is dead, and you're bleeding enough to pass out in about 5 minutes. Go to hell, McGraw." Morrison tried to cock his pistol for another shot, but his strength was failing. "Already been there. Found my way back." Silas stood over the fallen outlaw, his rifle pointed steadily at Morrison's chest. "Question now is whether you want to live long enough to stand trial or die here in the dirt like a rabid dog." Clara watched this exchange with fascination and fear. This was justice frontier style, administered by a man who'd been forced to become judge and executioner through circumstances beyond his control. She could see no mercy in Silas's face, but also no unnecessary cruelty. Morrison made his choice by attempting one final shot. Silas's rifle barked once, and Jake Morrison's reign of terror ended in a dusty valley 3 days from Denver. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara climbed down from the wagon on unsteady legs, her cast-iron skillet still in her hand. She'd grabbed it instinctively when the shooting started, some primitive part of her brain reaching for the most familiar weapon available. "Is it over?" she asked, looking around at the scattered bodies and wounded horses. "It's over," Silas confirmed, already moving to check on the wounded men. Despite everything they'd done, he couldn't let them suffer unnecessarily. "Help me tie up the ones who are still breathing. We'll drop them at the sheriff's office in the next town." Clara nodded, still processing what had just happened. She'd shot a man. Not killed him, but definitely shot him. The reality of it felt surreal, as if she'd been watching someone else's life unfold rather than living her own. "You did good," Silas said quietly, checking Morrison's body for any weapons they might have missed. "Held your ground, made your shots count. Emma's going to be proud when she hears how brave her new mother was." The word mother sent a warm shock through Clara's system. In the space of 10 minutes, she'd proven she could fight for their family, as fiercely as Silas could. She'd faced killers and emerged victorious. Most importantly, she'd chosen love over safety and found the strength to protect what mattered most. As they loaded their prisoners into the wagon and resumed their journey toward Denver, Clara found herself changed by the experience. She was no longer the timid widow who'd hidden from life in a mountain cabin. She was a woman who'd fought beside her man and proven worthy of the family they were building together. Emma was waiting, and now Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was ready to be the mother a brave little girl deserved. 3 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of their new cabin, watching Silas put the finishing touches on a hand-built cradle made from mountain pine. The wood gleamed honey gold in the afternoon sunlight, every joint fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. He'd carved tiny flowers around the rim, the same wildflowers that grew in the meadow where they'd chosen to build their new home. "It's beautiful," she said, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. Silas looked up from his work, his grey eyes soft with contentment. "Baby'll be here before snow flies." Wanted everything perfect for him. "Or her," Clara reminded him with a smile. "Or her," he agreed, rising to wrap his arms carefully around her expanding waist. "Either way, this little one's going to have everything we can give." The reunion with Emma had been everything Clara had hoped and more challenging than she'd anticipated. Mrs. Donovan had initially refused to even let them see the child, standing firm behind Denver's social conventions and her own protective instincts. But Emma herself had settled the matter by climbing out a second-story window and running 4 blocks through the city to find them at their hotel. Clara would never forget the moment when the cabin door burst open and a whirlwind of dark hair and flashing eyes threw herself into Silas's arms. 5 years of separation vanished in that instant, replaced by the elemental bond between father and daughter that no amount of distance or disapproval could break. "Papa!" Emma had sobbed against his chest. "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't forget me." "Never could forget you, little bird," Silas had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for a single day." Emma had turned those same bright eyes on Clara with undisguised curiosity. "Are you the lady who's going to marry Papa?" "I am," Clara had replied, kneeling to meet the girl at eye level. "If that's all right with you." Emma had studied her for a long moment with the serious attention of someone forced to grow up too quickly. Then she'd smiled, the same warm, transformative expression that Clara had learned to treasure in Silas. "Good," Emma had announced. "Papa needs someone to take care of him. He's not very good at remembering to eat regular meals." The transition hadn't been without difficulties. Emma had spent 5 years learning to be a proper young lady, and the adjustment to frontier life required patience from all of them. But beneath the city manners, Clara discovered a girl who still remembered how to track deer through forest undergrowth and identify edible plants by their leaves. More importantly, Emma had inherited her father's capacity for fierce loyalty. Once she'd decided Clara belonged in their family, she defended that decision with the same determination Silas showed in everything he attempted. Mrs. Donovan had eventually capitulated, though not gracefully. The legal proceedings had been complicated by territorial law and questions of parental rights, but Silas's reputation worked in his favor for once. Killing Jake Morrison and his gang had made him something of a local hero, and public opinion strongly favored reuniting a war hero with his daughter. The wanted poster that had once threatened their future now served a different purpose entirely. Emma had framed it and hung it in their cabin as proof of her father's legendary status. "My papa's famous," she'd told anyone who would listen. "He's the most dangerous man in the territory, but he makes the best pancakes you ever tasted." Now, watching Silas fuss over the cradle that would hold their first child together, Clara marveled at how completely their lives had changed. The lonely mountain woman and the feared gunfighter had somehow transformed into parents, preparing for their expanding family. "Emma should be back soon," Clara said, looking toward the path that led to their nearest neighbors. "Mrs. Henderson promised to teach her how to preserve peaches. Good skill to have." Silas ran his hand along the cradle's smooth edge one final time, though I suspect Emma's more interested in eating the peaches than preserving them. Clara laughed, remembering the sticky-faced girl who'd returned from yesterday's lesson with suspicious evidence around her mouth. "She's adjusting well to having neighbors again." "Better than I am," Silas admitted. "Still makes me nervous, having people close enough to drop by unannounced. You'll get used to it. Emma needs friends her own age, and our children will need a community to grow up in." The plural was deliberate. Clara's pregnancy had been confirmed just weeks after Emma joined their family, fulfilling Silas's impossible promise in ways none of them had expected. Dr. Patterson in Denver had pronounced her remarkably healthy and predicted no complications with the birth. "Still can't quite believe it's real," Silas said, placing his large hand gently over her belly. "After all these years of thinking I'd never have another child." "After all these years of thinking I'd never have any children," Clara corrected. "Emma counts, you know. She's as much mine now as this little one will be." "I know. She tells everyone you're her real mother now, the one who counts." Silas's voice carried deep satisfaction. "Yesterday she informed Mrs. Henderson that her other mother died a long time ago, but her real mother taught her how to make biscuits that don't burn." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Emma's easy acceptance of her as family had been one of the greatest gifts of this impossible year. "She's a remarkable child." "She's our child," Silas said firmly, "just like this little one will be. Family isn't just about blood, Clara. It's about choice, commitment, the decision to love someone no matter what." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared on the path from the neighbor's house, carrying a basket of peaches and chattering excitedly to their dog about something she'd learned. At 12, she was all legs and elbows, caught between childhood and the young woman she was becoming. "Mama! Papa!" she called, breaking into a run when she spotted them. "Mrs. Henderson says I can help her with the church social next week, and she's going to teach me how to make proper apple pies." Clara opened her arms to catch the enthusiastic girl, marveling again at how natural it felt to be called Mama by this bright, determined child. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." Emma deposited the peach basket carefully on the porch, then looked critically at the cradle. "Is it finished? Can I try rocking it?" "Gentle now," Silas warned, but his eyes were soft as he watched his daughter examine his work. "This cradle's got to last for all the babies we might have." "How many babies are we going to have?" Emma asked, with the practical curiosity that characterized all her questions. Clara and Silas exchanged glances over her head. "As many as God sees fit to send us," Clara replied diplomatically. "Good," Emma announced with satisfaction. "I want at least 3 more. And I want to help name them all." As evening fell over their mountain valley, Clara stood surrounded by her impossible family, the legendary mountain man who'd learned to love again, the bright daughter who'd bridged the gap between past and future, and the child growing beneath. Her heart who would complete their circle. The cradle sat ready beside their bed, a promise carved in pine and polished with hope. Outside, the wilderness that had once meant isolation now represented freedom, space for their children to grow, land where their family could flourish, a future limited only by their capacity to love and protect each other. Silas's promise, delivered in delirium and desperation, had become the foundation for something more beautiful than either of them had dared to imagine. Before spring, he'd made her a mother. But in the process, she'd made him a father again, and together they'd created the kind of family that could weather any storm the frontier might bring. In the gathering darkness, Clara whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances, impossible promises, and the kind of love that bloomed strongest in the harshest soil. Their story was just beginning.